I'm Stan Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. I've spent my career working as a professional negotiator and have taught a class on negotiation at Stanford University for over 20 years. On this podcast, I interview the experts, people who have negotiated in all walks of life. Together, we'll learn from their stories, their successes, their failures, and what they've learned along the way. Today, my guest is Molly Graham. Molly Graham has worked in Silicon Valley and has been at the intersection of fascinating negotiations at both Google and Facebook. She worked closely with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and has interesting stories about negotiations with them. She also ran the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which was Mark and Priscilla's nonprofit. She talks about gender in negotiation, negotiating a hyper-growth company, and I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Molly Graham.
Thanks, Stan. It's really nice to be here.
I've been excited for this conversation. You started at Google. How did you get that job? Did you have a technical background, or how did you get the job at Google in the first place? Was that a negotiation?
I would say that I stumbled sideways into Google. And the irony of that negotiation / decision is I don't think I negotiated that offer at all. They were like, do you want to earn, I think it was like $55,000 working in communications at Google. And I was like, yes, sold immediately. So 20 whatever year old me learned a lesson from that for sure.
Let's dive into that for a second. There's a lot of research that would support that women often take that first offer and don't ask for more, and men often ask for more. I think the thing I say to students is men often think they're worth more than they are, and women often think they're worth less than they are. In your subsequent career, do women tend not to negotiate as much in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Including me. First of all, I didn't negotiate my first two offers. Those two offers were from Google and Facebook. The Facebook offer, not negotiating that, probably cost me like a couple $1 million. Like, meaning
Wow.
Your first offer from a company or your first equity grant from a company is usually the biggest one you ever get. And if you don't negotiate that offer, if the company is successful, it's usually a very expensive decision, which is one thing I remind my friends when they're worried about negotiating. But yeah, I mean, I work with a lot of women on negotiating, just friends and through different parts of my life, and a lot of men. And I will say, gender is still just a big dynamic in this stuff. Most of my female friends, even if they're good at coaching other people on negotiating, when it comes time for them to ask for something, they get scared. They tend to think they don't deserve it, or they're worried that they're asking for too much. One of my friends has a rule that when she's negotiating something, what she does is go and ask her tallest white male friend what he would ask for. And then she asks for that. And I think it's beautiful because people move through the world differently, and gender just does play a role. And I think I still see it in the work that I do and when I talk to friends, and even in my own day-to-day, like I can coach everybody else on negotiating, but when it comes time for me to ask for something, I really do need someone standing next to me being like, no, put that number in the email and hit send, so.
What would your advice be? You and I agree that women tend not to ask for more or what they're owed. One piece of advice I give to students is if you're negotiating with a large company like Google, you can ask the question, are my male counterparts paid the same for the same role? I just want to make sure that I'm paid fairly. And big companies are pretty good at doing that these days. But what would your advice be to women as they negotiate job offers, other than get a tall white male friend?
Well, I mean, the first is, I would say always have a buddy, like never negotiate alone. It's so important to have someone like I will write emails for friends of mine and folks that I work with in my communities. I'll write your email for you back to the offer that they sent you. But our agreement is that you have to send the numbers I put in my email. You're not allowed to edit the numbers. So I just think always having a friend that's there by your side helping you negotiate it's so important because we're all just our own worst enemy in this stuff. And I think like the other thing is like you can always ask and they can always say no. And I've had some friends recently that have had some really bad experiences with asking for stuff. And for those in the world that don't think gender and race are an issue in this stuff anymore, I've had 2 Black female friends send one email back to an offer letter and receive responses that said they were the most aggressive negotiators the company had ever worked with. And in one case, the offer was rescinded just based on one email sent back. And if you think that would happen to a white man, you are crazy. But one of the things I tell people is in the process of negotiation, companies show you who they are. And if you're saying, I want to make sure that I'm being paid fairly relative to my peers, a good company is going to say, absolutely, let us explain to you how we do this. Here's our framework. Here's how we think about this. Like, here's how our bands work. They're going to have a way that they think about stuff, and it's going to be fair. A bad company is going to tell you that you're negotiating harder than anybody they've ever met, and they can't believe that you possibly want more and how selfish of you. That tells you something about the culture of that company that's good to know before you take a job there.
Yeah, that's great advice. Let's go back to Google days. So it was a hyper-growth company when you joined. What was that culture like, and how did persuasion and influence happen as we think about negotiating internally at Google and the culture? What was it like in those days?
Yeah. So I joined Google in 2007. Really what I think I got is an education in how things work when things are growing and changing that fast. And I would say if I had a lesson from that, it's actually one that I repeat today. Being great at your job gives you leverage. And that's something that's really important in negotiation or just the process of trying to grow and get more responsibility inside these companies. Like, thing one is being great at your job. And I say that now to founders, right? Meaning like you're trying to negotiate for more investment, et cetera, whatever, with your board. Building a great, strong company is the biggest piece of leverage you have. So it's the same for individuals and companies, which is you're more powerful, the better your business is. You're more powerful, the more people want to work with you. And that comes down to being useful and great at your job.
Yeah, one of the things that I say to young people who always fear that they're doing an unbelievable job and nobody's noticing is, if you're effective, people notice. Just get some stuff done, and it will be rewarded. And I think so many young people think that they're the big contributor and no one's noticed, and that person doesn't exist in the organization. Okay, well, you left Google after that year and a half and went to Facebook. Let's drill down to one specific experience that you've talked to me about at Facebook, was your role in pursuing mobile. And that was sort of a, in the end, ill-fated attempt. But talk about how that happened. What were the negotiations that you had there that were relevant? What did you learn about negotiation from that experience? And just give us a little context.
Yeah, so it's you have to go back in time because basically it was 2010. The iPhone launched in 2007. So mobile was very, very young. And what happened for Facebook is that really quickly we started to see our mobile usage take off. And it became pretty clear in those years that mobile was actually going to be our first platform, not our second. Meaning we weren't going to be desktop first. We were going to be mobile first in terms of how the majority of our users used our app at the time. And that was a hugely risky position for Facebook to be in, because it actually meant that, and I think it's important to understand that there was basically a giant Cold War going on between Google and Facebook. And then Apple was over here as a mostly neutral third party for a long time, not neutral anymore. But Facebook and Google hated each other, and that showed up in 1,000 ways. It showed up in recruiting, it showed up in real estate, it showed up in business. But as Android started to take off and Facebook started to see mobile usage take off, all of a sudden we faced a future where basically our livelihood, right, like our ability to exist might depend on Apple and Google if we didn't have a platform, because it was either the iPhone or Android. And at the time, Microsoft was around as well, Windows Phone. But it was like, oh God, strategically, if we don't have power inside of this ecosystem, we are just an app on someone else's platform and they can do all sorts of stuff to us, which, by the way, is what has happened. So at the time, they launched an initiative that was like, how do we get power inside of the mobile ecosystem? And the first thought was to build a phone, to literally build hardware and an operating system to try to own the whole stack. And it was early enough that seemed plausible. But lots of lessons learned from that experience that I would not go into. But it was basically existential for Facebook. We had to figure out how to get power inside of that Cold War, because otherwise the company would get destroyed. And so I was asked to join this project.
Yeah, let's talk about that process? Because you can't just do a mobile phone with inside Facebook without negotiating with partners. So any stories that would be relevant for listeners on that front?
Yeah, so Facebook was an application company, right? We built a desktop app and a mobile app. We knew nothing about hardware and we knew nothing about building an operating system. So we immediately went out and found a hardware partner. To some extent, almost like too early in the process, we found a hardware partner. And interestingly, the first hardware partner we went to work with was Intel. And the reason I think that partnership happened, we had a relationship with them, is they were also behind in mobile. So they had this huge incentive to try to figure out who was going to be the other platform. Like if it was like Apple and Google, was it going to be Microsoft? They obviously have Intel has a complicated relationship with Microsoft. And so they were very excited about like maybe getting to be our partner, because I think a lot of people believed we might be able to build another platform that mattered. So for them, the incentive was to get to be part of that platform and to get some power inside that ecosystem and get chips inside of phones. And the other partner we started working with from the beginning was AT&T. We talked to Verizon and we talked to AT&T. And if I have one of my many lessons from that whole experience is, holy crap, AT&T is an amazing company for how big and complicated it is at turning on a dime. We showed up and they were like, yep, we'll do it. And they stayed with us through what was an absolute goat rodeo of a 4-year project. They were extraordinary partners through thick and thin. And it's actually how I think they won the iPhone as well. Because if you remember when iPhone launched, they were exclusively on AT&T.
Exclusive, yeah.
And Verizon was so hard to work with. We just they couldn't move at our speed. They couldn't sort of say yes. There was a lot of bureaucracy. And so AT&T was just like sort of obviously the right partner. And it's so embedded in the DNA, I guess, of that company, which is just that they believe they have to say yes to things. They're going to say yes to a lot of failures, but it will let them potentially be the partner for the next iPhone, as if they say yes to sort of the crazy bets. But there was a huge dynamic inside those partnerships as well around Google and Apple. But Google really did not want us to build this phone. And they did a lot of stuff to try to get their partners not to work with us. And that was just like, for me, I felt like I spent 3 years sitting inside, like I said, this Cold War inside Silicon Valley, where like everybody had missiles pointed at each other. And I sort of felt like I got to witness one of the most interesting dynamics in business, which is when companies are negotiating with each other, but it's through these like really long distance rockets. And a lot of it is trying to hurt or destroy each other or just maintain power. But it's through sort of very disparate things, from recruiting to partnerships to, real estate and things like that.
So there's 3 companies. Let's talk a little bit about the Cold War, and it still exists. And as you said, Apple's kind of entered the Cold War more recent years.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's even cold anymore. Yeah,
a hostile hot war. As you guys would talk internally about the Cold War, were there tactics in negotiation or strategies, especially against Google, that you would try to use in any of those areas, whether it was on the phone, real estate, employees? What worked?
I mean, when it's a true Cold War, meaning these are big companies that see each other as like fundamental threats to their business, you're using every dimension. Talent is a huge war, which means, the talent war between Google and Facebook was ugly. Like, we had engineers that would get an offer from us. They would start, and 2 days in, they would go back to Google because Google offered them like $10 million. And it became so crazy that you could basically be sitting at Google, exactly the same level, exactly the same job, and one of you had gotten an offer from Facebook and you were making $10 million more than the other person. Like, they were so aggressive with the counter offers. And, we did not do that for a long time for a bunch of reasons. But, talent war is like a huge way that companies compete with each other, trying to get the best talent in the world. I think for us, like, it was just always a multidimensional war. One of the things that companies eventually compete with is intellectual property. So filing patents, so that basically that's a whole Cold War that happens between these companies, where like if I have enough patents, then invariably you're going to step on mine. And if I step on yours, then it's sort of a mutually assured destruction thing. And that became like a business at Facebook at some point, which is just like filing patents so that you kind of can't get attacked from an IP perspective. But the phone and the dynamics really in the mobile ecosystem were, and I would say still are, such a significant part of the business war between Facebook and Google significantly, and then Apple for sure in the last 5 years has really taken a stance with that little dialogue that shows up that says, ask app not to track. That dialogue had a massive effect on Facebook's business because it has an effect on personalized ads, which is Facebook's entire, the majority of their revenue at this point. That was the name of the game, is who has power over everybody else. And eventually, the phone failed at Facebook. And that meant that we had to find power other ways. And one of the greatest powers you can have on somebody else's platform is if you are the most popular applications. So Facebook made it its business to own as many of the most popular applications as it could. Because if Google threatens you and says hey, we're going to make you give us a percentage of your advertising revenue, or we're going to take away ads or whatever, or what Apple did, you can say, okay, I'm going to pull Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger, and Facebook out of your app store. At least you have some power.
Yeah, it's been surprising to me, honestly, that strategy has worked so far, because just trying to always buy the next app, you're vulnerable. I know that Facebook famously tried to buy Snapchat and failed. I think they've tried with Oculus to develop a platform, unclear whether that's going to succeed. But to me, the Facebook model seems vulnerable because of that, because the power is really in the platform, I think, more than the apps. Is that a rational way to look at it?
Yeah. I mean, meaning that's why we tried to build a phone. That's why we tried to build an operating system, is because the power is in owning the thing that other people build on top of. But it became okay, we have two tracks. The first is go get power inside the existing mobile ecosystem, right? Go buy WhatsApp, which there's a reason why that acquisition was as big of a number as it is, and try to buy Snapchat and all that stuff. The second is go try to be the next platform, which is the Oculus play. And to some extent now you see it with AI and crypto and things like that. They are actively trying to make sure they have power in whatever the next ecosystem is. But yeah, I mean, at some point as a company, this happens to all the big guys, right? You're extraordinary at a thing. That thing gets challenged or destroyed or hurt or damaged, I would say. So social, right? And we were social web, and then we became mobile. And you have to figure out how to have power in wherever the new dynamics go. And that will either work or it won't, right? You can see companies go from being many hundreds of billions of dollars, or many hundreds of millions of dollars to not very big because their strategic position got destroyed in one way or another. So I think it's an ongoing battle. But Mark is great at fighting battles.
You're betting on him.
I would never. One of the rules in life is never bet against Mark Zuckerberg.
I like it. Well, you left after 4 years at Facebook?
5, yeah.
5 years at Facebook. And did you go directly to another job? Did you take time off? What was your thought?
I left without another job. I was really burnt out at Facebook, and I did not feel like I was going to be good at making decisions. They asked me to stay, and they offered me a lot of possible jobs there, but I don't know. I was really burnt out. So I left and took some time off, which I believe is one of the best things you can do in order to make good decisions about the next thing. It's obviously a privilege and you have to be able to afford it financially, but it's often really hard to make good decisions going from one job to the next.
Yeah, let me underscore that, because there's this cliche, which you and I agree probably shouldn't be, which is you should never leave a job until you have a job. And I tell young people, no, pause, collect yourself. And so you and I see that the same way. I think, looking for a job is a full-time job in of itself, and you can't do that while you have a job.
One thing I also tell friends is you can do that. You can search from where you are now, but you have to usually do it under the covers, right? You usually have to ping a bunch of people, and you're not trying to let your company know that you're looking. Whereas if you leave and then start searching, you never know what will happen when you post on LinkedIn and say, hey, I've left. People come out of the woodwork. And I've had the experience of taking one job and then having another job show up a couple months later that I'm wish I had known that was a possibility. So there is something really valuable actually about searching in the open in terms of actually surfacing opportunities that you might not have been able to surface otherwise.
One other thing I'd like to add to that is you want to leave your job well. And I think when you're looking from a job, you tend to make those transitions quickly and you leave people hanging. And it always amazes me, I've hired hundreds of people in my career and a lot of them left badly. They left projects undone. And my thought every time is, I'm a future reference for you. You know that having worked for me for years, people are going to call me and ask about that. And I'm just surprised that people tend to leave jobs badly. And I think that's a mistake for negotiating your career.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I always say that like the only thing you take with you from companies is number one, the thing you learned. And then number two, relationships.
So you did follow someone that you'd met at Facebook to your next company. Talk about that.
I had worked for Brett Taylor, who most people now have heard of. He's on the board of Twitter when all that went down. And so after I left Facebook, I took a couple months off and I called Brett and said, hey, I'm going to start looking for jobs. And he said, great, want to meet tomorrow at 9 a.m.? And I said, sure. And I had an offer from them within a week. I ended up with the title Chief Operating Officer. I basically ran everything that wasn't product and engineering there.
And that company, as I remember, got sold. Talk about that from a negotiation perspective.
Yeah, so Quip was essentially like Google Docs or Microsoft Office, but designed for mobile. And it was really designed for multi-device. It was meant to be really easy to edit literally wherever you were. And so we entered the space of productivity. And we spent 3.5 years building the company. And, one of the things Brett said to me is like, you have to go after big problems. You have to go after things that are valuable to other people because that just makes your company more valuable, essentially. And that turned out to be true. Again, to the theme of Cold Wars, we ended up in the middle of a giant Cold War, a totally different one than the one that was at Facebook. But there was a Cold War between Salesforce, Microsoft, where it's funny to remember these dynamics, but basically Microsoft had tried to buy Salesforce. That acquisition failed. And then Salesforce actually tried to buy LinkedIn. And then Microsoft came in at the last minute and took LinkedIn away from Salesforce. So Mark Benioff was just mad. And, Salesforce is a very powerful company from a SaaS perspective, from a business to business perspective, but they don't have anything in productivity. And the way that Microsoft sells, for anybody that's sold against them, it is a wild experience because they do just huge amounts of cross-selling. So they cross-sell from Azure, which is their cloud competitor, into Office, into like all these other products. And so once they have a foot in the door, it's very hard to compete against them. And for Salesforce, they were losing sales because they didn't have an Office competitor or whatever piece. So they actually built a strategic partnership with Amazon because they didn't want to build a cloud provider, or Heroku hadn't exactly done what it was supposed to do. So they were building this strategic alliance with Amazon because both of them needed to compete with Microsoft, and neither of them had productivity. So we basically got drawn into that Cold War because I think Brett and Mark Benioff knew each other, and we were literally one of the only options out there in terms of like folks that were actually going after productivity. And that led to a very valuable acquisition where Salesforce bought us for $750 million.
So how did you get to the $750 million and what do we learn from the negotiation there?
Yeah, there's a lot of dimensions of that deal to learn from. I would say the first is we built a partnership with Salesforce first, and they invested in our Series B. And one of the things that a friend that has sold 3 companies told me pretty early on in my time at Quip is all strategic acquisitions come from partnerships. And that is very true. Like not 100% true, but it's like 90% true, meaning it's very rare that they genuinely come out of thin air. They usually come because you've started trying to work together. And then, one of them, the buyer sort of casually says, what if we bought you? Or it just becomes this natural extension of working together. So it's an important thing to think about as a founder when you're thinking about how to take care of your company is like, what partnerships should you build, right? So that you have possible long-term options. But we really weren't intending to sell. Brett was pretty actually staunch about not wanting to sell the company. And we had a really wonderful board. So I would say the second piece of this, which was salient for the whole thing, was that we had a board that was willing to do whatever it took to work with Brett. And they were all going to make money. They might not make I'm I think the Series A folks did just fine, but the Series B folks were going to get like a 2x out of it. But, I think they knew that their relationship with Brett probably mattered more than the 2x. And so when he said, I think we want to sell to Salesforce, they were like, okay. And by the way, we didn't shop it at all. That was a choice that Brett made, that Brett and Kevin Gibbs made, the two founders. We could have shopped it to Microsoft and I think would have easily ended up with a valuation much higher. But Brett, again, very much like Mark Zuckerberg, just like didn't want to do that. He was like, I don't want to go fake shop this and kind of create a bidding war. I don't want to go work at Microsoft. Like, I don't want to move to Seattle or whatever would be required in order to do that. So he was like, I just want to get the best offer we can from Salesforce, and I want to do that. And the board said yes. But the last piece of the negotiation that was really fascinating is that, and this is important, I think, for founders to learn from, because in a strategic acquisition, you actually have power. And it goes in many different directions. But this was a relatively lucrative acquisition. And if he had just taken the deal, all of that money would have gone primarily to investors. But he specifically negotiated a $100 million holdout for employees for retention. It came in the form of retention grants for those folks, so vested over time. But he very specifically negotiated that both with Salesforce and with his board. It meant that the board had to take a lower offer. It meant they took 650 something million, I think. And the rest went to employees. But that is a hugely generous and thoughtful thing that you can only do if you have power. But there are lots of stories in the Valley of founders that have had very lucrative acquisitions where all of the money went to preferred and common. And that means employees often don't make that much money off of acquisitions like that. And that is something that as a founder, sometimes you actually have control over. Like, I've been part of a board of a company that sold, and the founder did the same thing, and the board agreed to make sure that employees got something out of the deal when it wouldn't have happened naturally based on the cap table.
Yeah. In my experience, founders have more leverage in that negotiation than founders think they have.
Yeah.
Preferred investors like to, think they have the reins in the process, and they convince founders that they're kind of the top dog. But at the end of the day, sales can't happen without the management team. And so I've done the same thing, which is negotiate carve-outs for employees that come out of the preferred. And I think if founders knew that was an option, they would do it more often. I don't think you have to be Brett Taylor to do that.
No, I agree. And I appreciate the point, because I think, power does matter a little, but a lot of the negotiation is with your board. It's not necessarily with the acquirer, because the acquirer can set the price. And then the question is, how does that get divided up? Yeah. And again, it depends on your board and what kind of people they are and how their funds are doing and things like that. But you can ask, right? They can always say no. But lots of founders don't even ask.
Yeah. We don't have time to go into it now, but I'll just mention a couple of things there. Often young people want to raise capital from whoever's the most prestigious investor, as opposed to who's going to be the best partner. And often those things inversely correlate. Brand matters for certain things from investors, but when you get in those tough moments, some of the most prestigious firms are the least flexible, in my experience.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
Listeners probably be interested in some of your insights on Mark as a negotiator, things that he did particularly well in negotiation and things that you kind of found difficult as an employee having to work closely with him.
Mark is an extraordinary negotiator. I think he learned from really amazing people. Sheryl and Dan Rose, who's the head of partnerships and business development and corporate development there. But I also think Mark is just naturally a very good negotiator. And I think there's a couple things he's really extraordinary at that I wish more founders would learn from. The first is that when he wants something, he just goes after it. Like, it's not a bunch of bullshit. He's just like, no, we want to buy you. Like, how do we make that happen? And the second is that he's extraordinarily fast. He just does not let lawyers drive timelines. That is not how that happens. He's like, we're going to buy Instagram, we're going to do it in a weekend. FriendFeed, Brett Taylor tells this story of Mark buying FriendFeed, and Brett ended up firing his lawyers in the middle of the process and hiring new lawyers because his lawyers weren't moving fast enough. And both he and Mark agreed that they wanted to get it done in a weekend. There's a really funny picture of Amin, who was the head of corporate development at Facebook for many years, after the WhatsApp acquisition closed, which I think closed extremely fast. Once it was negotiated, like he's like passed out on a couch because he hadn't slept in a couple days. So I think speed is your friend in negotiation. And that's something Mark is really exceptional at because it just doesn't leave a lot of room for waffling and other players to come in and things like that. So I think clarity and speed are like two things he was extraordinary at. And then the last thing I would just say is Facebook was just very clear about like all that matters are incentives. I learned that over and over again from Mark, which is either your incentives are aligned as two companies or they're not. And that's actually fundamentally the only thing that matters when you're building a partnership or when you're buying something. Either people want to make this happen or they don't. And I remember so many different times during many different negotiations, like it being repeated, like the red line and the paper matter, but they don't actually matter because if people want to get out of the partnership, they will. So what matters is if you're heading in the same direction, if your incentives are aligned, then it'll work and the paper doesn't matter. If things start to deteriorate, if your incentives start to go in different directions, then the paper definitely doesn't matter. They will get out of the partnership if they want to.
Yeah, I had some experiences with Mark. He was my neighbor when Facebook was up on Stanford Avenue, and he would do a lot of meetings by walking around, and we would bump into each other, and we would chat about things. And one thing I noticed about Mark is he was amazingly focused. I was running an investment bank at that time, and he would just ask me about it and drill down and get to the heart of it. There was just no small talk with Mark. And I found he was already a really famous guy in those days, but I found that he was genuinely interested. He wanted to see what he could learn in a 10-minute conversation from me. And the times that we, as neighbors, just kind of bumped into each other and chatted, he was always trying to suck information out of me. And I always thought in those conversations, shouldn't I be sucking information out of you? You're running Facebook. But was that your experience with him, that he was really good at focusing and drilling down?
Yeah, well, I would say it slightly differently, but absolutely. So I think the thing that people don't understand about Mark, unless you have worked with him or know him well, is Mark is, I would say, probably the most extraordinary learner I've ever met. That man learns faster and is a bigger sponge for knowledge than anyone I've ever spent time with. I think it's, a hallmark of extraordinary founders is how fast and voraciously they learn. Mark was exceptional at that. And he took every opportunity, to your point, to do that. So you're in a room for 10 minutes with him, he's going to try to learn something from you. I think like a lot of founders look at his journey and think, oh, of course you found a company and then you're able to take it public, turn it into a Fortune, 5 or whatever, and stay in charge. And that just simply isn't true. Most people cannot do what it takes to grow and learn as much as Mark did. And if you spend time with like any other extraordinary founder like Bill Gates or a lot of the folks, Jeff Bezos, et cetera, these folks are all voracious learners. And I think it's one thing that people take for granted is how big and how hard that journey was for him.
Yeah, people often ask me, oh, Stan, I'm not going to be able to take your negotiation class, but give me the 5 things. Give me the most important things I need to know about negotiation. And one of them is the ability to ask penetrating questions, to really drill down and listen and be open to learning. And I do agree with you that some of the most extraordinary people that I've met in Silicon Valley are constantly mining me for information and using that information somehow in the negotiation. So being a good listener and a good questioner, I think are one of the 2 keys in negotiation.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that just a life skill? I always say you can learn something from anybody. You just have to believe and you have to learn how to try. Right. And I think there are people that approach the world like that, right? Like I can learn something from anyone. And then there are people that approach the world like I know everything and you should learn something from me.
Yep. Security versus insecurity. Let's talk briefly about Sheryl, because you worked with her as well, and she's another extraordinary person in tech. So what was her negotiation style, strategy? What did you learn from her on the negotiation front?
Yeah, well, I will say working for Sheryl Sandberg is like getting a class in management excellence. And there's so many different dimensions to that. I always told her that it was like I didn't need to go to business school because I got to work with her. I feel like I learned so many different things from her. But when it comes to negotiation, I think one of the things that Sheryl is really extraordinary at, I would put it in her like top 3 strengths, is relationships. Like relationships are a business to her. She is very structured and active in terms of how she builds them and manages them, from individual people to companies to whatever. And I think like she has the ability to pick up the phone and call a lot of people that are very important and whatever. But that is not just like something she can do because she was famous, because she wasn't famous for a very long time. It was because she like built relationships with people as in a very structured and thoughtful way, so that when it came time to work together or Facebook needed something, it didn't feel like out of the blue for her to call people. And even with like the partnerships that I like ran and led while I was there, she was so active and structured and thoughtful about how you ran a good partnership. Like I remember, Sheryl would care like who talked first in a meeting. She would care how you structured the agenda of certain meetings. She would care what the room looked like. If Mark is the brain, I feel like Sheryl was so much of the like building alliances and relationships between Facebook and other companies and political entities and things like that.
I want to highlight one thing you said, which I think is important, which is she spent time building relationships away from a need to be in a transaction. And I think so often people think they can have just-in-time relationships and make a few nice comments, but it's really, there's no substitute for spending actual time with people. And I think Silicon Valley, specifically in the United States generally, we tend to be more transactional and just expect that you can show up in some conference room and get something done. And there's just no substitute in my experience for actually spending time learning about that person, independent of what you might need from them in a business transaction. So I think that was really well said.
Yeah, absolutely. My phrase around that, which is 1000% something I learned from Sheryl, is life is a barter economy, which means that you need to give people things. You need to be valuable to people. You need to help them and expect nothing in return, because you have to believe that it will come back to you someday. You have to be the kind of person where when you need someone, it's easy to pick up the phone and call them because you've already done 5 things for them. So they know, hey, like, of course I'll pick up the phone and of course I'll help you get that job or whatever because you helped me in the past. And so, yeah, life is a barter economy, man. You got to treat it that way.
Fantastic. As we finish up, just catch us up on what you're currently doing, because it's pretty different than working for Google, Facebook, or the Zuckerberg Chan initiative.
Yeah. So I run a community called the Glue Club, which is focused on helping startup leaders, so folks that tend to work for founders, find sanity, and also learn from each other in terms of how to build great organizations. So we basically build guided, structured learning experiences that help folks find peers that they can learn from, but also get them access to experts that can show them sort of what does good look like in terms of company building. Because it's not something you learn in business school, how to build something from nothing or how to work with complicated founders or new founders or any of that. So ours is like a community of practice that tries to sort of bring the best of both learning from peers and learning from folks that have done it before.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. It was a great conversation. I think we need to do part 2 because we only scratched the surface of some of this. But I really appreciate your time, and thank you, Molly Graham.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Stan.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.